Welcome to the Research and Writing Seminar. Let's go to the first slide. As you think about writing this semester, you need to realize that academic writing is different than the way you talk to somebody else. Academic writing is a type of writing that forces you to go in a straight line. It's not going all over the board and talking about a subject matter in an unorganized fashion. So the point of this whole slide presentation is to try to get you to present your material in an organized fashion that goes in a specific direction. So let's take a look at what this means. Let's go to the next slide. Here you see a picture of a barn with a whole bunch of different bullseyes, and sometimes professors get papers and it looks like the paper is written all over the place, and we read the paper and we're left scratching our heads because we're wondering what in the world is the student trying to hit. They're just trying to hit everything. And so what I want you to do is picture this slide and picture it with just one bullseye, and that everything is geared to ensuring that all your arrows hit the one bullseye, because that's what we're looking for as profs when we read your papers. Let's go to the next slide. So how do you start? Well, you start basically by asking yourself a question. The overarching question you need to ask yourself is, what is the point of this paper? Now, specifically, if you're doing a theology paper, you might ask yourself, what is the eschatological view that had the greatest impact on the evangelical film industry? So there you have a question. Now the rest of your paper is going to be different answers in relationship to that question. Now another way to do it might be to have a thesis. So your thesis might be, the predominant eschatological view that has had the greatest impact on evangelical film is premillennialism. Then the rest of your paper are a series of arguments supporting this theory. Now in a few other courses you may want to employ a theory and then provide proofs for that theory. So if you're in the anthropology class, you may say modernization theory best explains the reason why there are growing groups of men isolating themselves in Japan. And then you can provide proofs why modernization theory is the best theory in order to explain this phenomena of more and more single men hiding themselves in their parents' basement in Japan as they get older and older. Now remember, all this is in relationship to your syllabi. Your syllabi is going to direct you as to how you may need to format this or write this up. Let's go to the next slide. How do you get organized? Well, what's the purpose of the assignment? Again, your syllabi is going to help you do this. You need to ask yourself, what kind of assignment is this? Is this an argumentative research paper? And in this case, you might want to throw out a thesis. Is this a historical research paper? And so you might want to look at a certain doctrine and you trace it historically, a certain theme that you want to trace historically, or the exegesis of a certain passage, and you might want to look at that, how it was historically treated. You may have an exegesis paper, and in that case, you're going to go to both commentaries and word studies and grammatical issues as you put this together, and we'll take a look at that in a few slides later on. Your formats for book reviews, reflection papers, sermons, journals, qualitative research papers, and quantitative research papers. This will all be explained in those specific classes. We're basically going to look in this PowerPoint at the first three options: the argumentative research paper, the historical research paper, and the exegesis paper. Let's go to the next slide. So the first thing you want to do is either ask a question or formulate a thesis. And like I mentioned before, if you ask a question, then the rest of your paper will be a series of answers to this primary question. The question I threw out previously was related to the predominant eschatological view that impacted evangelical film. So then you would go through the answers to the answers. And you might show a series of films, starting with the earliest films made in the evangelical film industry. You might do this chronologically. Or you might take a look at the ones that had the greatest impact and push it in terms of that direction. Maybe there's a logical sequence to answering the questions, or maybe they're just random. Again, if you do a thesis, you might state that the predominant view is premillennialism. All right, then the rest of your theses are going to defend the fact that this is the predominant eschatological view. So in the end, you're going to start with a question or a thesis, and then in the conclusion you might want to restate the question and restate succinctly the defense you gave. So you start with an introduction, you state your theses, and then your body is going to have a series of answers or defenses, and then you're going to conclude by restating the question or thesis and then giving your final answer. Now, an argumentative research paper, what exactly is this? Well, it has a point, and that is the big bullseye on the barn. You want to assert right at the opening in your paper. Now, you might want to phrase it something like, the predominant thesis of this research paper is as follows. All right, and then you fill it in. Or the driving force of this research paper is to, and then you state it. And you put it boldly out there. Not that you have to use bold type, but that's very clear as to what you're driving at in this paper. And it'll give direction to the person reading your paper, which in this case will be your prof. Then it describes and assesses various points in the light of your thesis. So back to what is the predominant eschatological view that has the greatest impact in evangelical film, you're going to have to take a look at the other points as well. What kind of impact has postmillennialism had on film, or amillennialism had on film? And so you look at these different variants and to see what case can be made. Now, what are we looking for? We're looking for your ability to think critically and independently. So outline the issue, outline your thesis statement, and outline the best solution to this thesis or this research question. Then demonstrate this to us. Demonstrate this to us through the validity of your thesis as you progress through this in the body of your paper. And then finally, synthesize your arguments, summarize your arguments in your closing section, and state that this is obviously the best solution. Now, what is it not? It's not just a summary discussion of a particular topic or repeating all the arguments out there. Again, if it's just a summary discussion, or if you're repeating all these traditional arguments that are related to this, but it's not focused on hitting the bullseye, hitting your thesis statement, or hitting the research question and answering that, then you're going to get docked. We're going to be wondering, what in the world is the point of all this? So, yes, we're going to look at how well your thesis is defended. Have you included opposing views and defended your thesis against these opposing views? Have you looked at relevant social, historical, cultural, and literary aspects of your thesis and those of other theses? Have they also been addressed? It is not just making a case for yours, it is also realizing the fact that there are other answers out there that may be very legitimate, but you're pointing out to us why these are less valid than the one you are putting forward. You don't have to be original. I mean, you're an MDiv student, you're an MA student, you're a graduate student, you're not doing doctoral work. But what we are looking for is that you are engaging the literature. You are looking at journals. You are reading widely. It's not like you took one commentary off the shelf and wrote your paper on the basis of one or two sources. I mean, 10, 20 sources for a research paper should easily be there in your bibliography. We want to see the fact that you're looking not just from one narrow standpoint, but you're engaging variant positions in the light of your thesis statement. Let's take a look at the next. For a historical research paper, you may want to discuss the origins of a certain topic. Maybe it's liberation theology. You want to see, how did liberation theology start? What were the early people who wrote about this, who took this idea and flushed it out? Maybe you want to look at the doctrine of the church, or the origin of the church in Nepal and how it happened. And in this, you may also want to treat it like an argumentative research paper. So you may look at eschatology from the perspective of history and put out there the dominant eschatological position throughout history has been X, Y, and Z. And then you build your case just like a traditional paper, but you use a thesis statement within your historical research paper. Now the next slide here shows the exegesis paper. Now in the exegesis paper, you're looking at a text. And as you look at a text, you're obviously going to have to read commentaries and use commentaries coming at this text from different angles. You're going to have to look at Bible dictionaries and journal articles. So we're going to flip back to your bibliography and say, all right, who did this person consult, and where did he get his sources? Is he looking at it from multiple perspectives? Like any text, you're going to have to identify the issues of the words and morphemes involved in the text. You're going to have to look at the grammatical structures. You're going to have to look at the larger picture, the semantic unit in which this text may occur. You're going to look at the genre of the text itself. You're going to have to look at the broader context in terms of the book and when this book was written, the passages in the Old and New Testament that might relate to this book, other passages that influence the interpretation of this section under discussion. So it's both the minutiae of the morpheme as well as the cultural context in which this was written and how it relates to the rest of Scripture. And many of you are going into Christian service. So it's always useful to not only know what this text says, but then to be able to use this text in a manner in the church. And so you might want to see how you could preach this particular text as well, and include that in a section in your paper. Now, for issues like critical reflection papers, book reviews, journals, quantitative research papers, etc., go to your instructor, look at the class syllabi, find out exactly what you need to do by talking to the instructor. Now, the prof. What's the prof looking? Again, the prof is looking to see if this paper is clearly going in a certain direction. We are trying to identify early on what is the thesis, a research question, and then we're asking ourselves, all right, do all the other sections speak to this topic or this research question? Do the answers make sense? Is this clearly portrayed, and are the sections clearly connected? And then as we come to the end of the paper, we're looking at your conclusion, and does it logically follow from everything else you said in the body of the paper and the opening research and thesis in your introductory section. Now, questions are often raised regarding how much to quote. Now, certain papers have no quotes at all, or they have just a handful of quotes, or we may get a bibliography and nothing is ever quoted. And then on the other extreme, we have quotes everywhere. So part of the question is, how much do you quote? And driving this should be the question, what is the purpose of this quote? Why am I borrowing this quote from this person? Let's go to the next slide. First of all, when you quote, you got to make sure you represent the author. Somewhere you're obviously in the paper making a point, and so you're trying to make an impact, and so you're borrowing a quote to strengthen your argument. And it may be a well-worded quote, and so you don't want to misrepresent the author. You want to make an impact. You want this to build on your case for your thesis. Now you got to realize that quoting is not merely to fill space. Yes, we've all had students who quote ad nauseum, and sometimes they quote huge sections when it could just be the first two sentences, and they might quote a whole paragraph. So really choose carefully what you quote. Now, quoting shouldn't replace your opinion or assessment. We want to see what authors say, but we are also looking to see that you are critically engaged with material. What are your opinions of these other perspectives that are being talked about in your paper? And we aren't necessarily assuming agreement. You may quote something, but you may have to show agreement that with the point that you're quoting. So make this clear. Plagiarism happens in the seminary, and basically it's theft. You are taking somebody else's thoughts, you're taking somebody else's ideas, and you're presenting them as your own. Do not plagiarize. It can endanger your life, your student life here, and it can have serious repercussions to your academic career. Let's go to the next slide. What happens if your professor suspects plagiarism? Well, depending on how clear-cut it is, often the professor will ask you to come and see him. And they will discuss, and he will point out why he thinks this is plagiarized, and the result might be a reduction on the assignment. He may, on the other hand, ask for a resubmission, and the resubmission may have a cap on the top grade you could get. Maybe, if it's serious, you will either fail the assignments, you may even fail the course. For some students over the years, we have had students plagiarize multiple times in different courses, and so this again might lead you to be put on academic probation. Now, you need to realize that when you are guilty and proven guilty of plagiarism, a notation is made to the registrar's office, and so this will go on your transcript. Now, when the registrar puts this on, it's only known between you, the professor, and the registrar. The problem often is when another professor also sends in a notation and the registrar sees a pattern emerging. At that point in time, the academic committee may meet to discuss your situation as a student at this institution, and it may lead to expulsion. So do not plagiarize. Let's go to the next slide. How to avoid plagiarism? Well, clearly show where you borrow the material. Give the authority, give the author, give the originator, etc. Enclose the exact wording, use quotation marks, use your own words and style when summarizing material, footnote all this material or endnotes. Just see what kind of format the student or the professor asks you to submit the material, and be honest. On occasion, it's an honest mistake, and just state it's an honest mistake, and perhaps the source is in your bibliography but not in your footnotes. It's a lot easier to be honest than to try to hide. Well, thanks for this first section of the slideshow here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the sections as well.
Hi, I'm Randall Rouser, and I'll be talking in the next few slides about choosing a thesis or a topic for your paper. Well, what is a thesis statement? Put simply, a thesis statement is a succinct statement of the topical range and discursive intent of a paper. So by topical range, what is your topic? What are you going to be talking about? And discursive intent means what are you going to be arguing about the topic? So, for example, a very straightforward way to put a thesis topic or a thesis statement is, I will argue in this paper that, and then you state what you will argue. Now, there are more subtle ways to convey that information to the reader as well, but for the sake of clarity, you might well want to put your thesis statement in a very bald way like that, so nobody misses the point of your paper. Because it's nice to be subtle, but it's no good to be subtle if the reader doesn't know really what you're trying to communicate. You don't want to lose your audience. Now, when it comes to the importance of the thesis or the priority of the thesis for the paper, I mean, this is really important because the thesis statement is really the raison d'etre, or the reason for being of the paper. This is why you're writing. You're writing an argumentative paper to establish your thesis. The thesis is what drives the paper. It is the engine that drives the locomotive that pulls the whole train. Now you want to begin with a topic of interest. So what is your topic that you want to talk about? And that's going to set you off. And then as you begin to read about the topic, you will find, hopefully, a thesis emerging. Or the professor, in some cases, may give you a thesis statement to work with. But if you're developing your own thesis statement, you'll find it emerging out of the topic as you begin to read and get your bearings on the field. And keep something in mind, that if you begin with an initial thesis statement, you may well find as your research progresses that you want to revise your thesis statement. You may want to make it broader because you may find it's really too narrow for the subject, for the paper. Or you may want to narrow it. You may find that your initial thesis statement was too broad. Or you may want ultimately to argue the exact opposite of what you had initially decided you were going to argue. Well, unless your professor has stipulated that you have to remain with the initial thesis statement you've chosen, unless he or she has stated that, you have every right to revise your thesis statement, to expand it, to narrow it, or to flip it around and argue the converse. And that is something important to keep in mind, because sometimes students think, well, I've committed at the beginning to arguing this, so I have to stay with that the whole way. And that's not the case. As you move into the literature and become better acquainted with it, you may well find that your thesis is redefined. Okay, so where do we get started in developing the research for a paper? I think one of the mistakes students often make is they begin with sort of high-level academic resources right at the beginning. They may, for example, they want to argue a paper on the problem of evil. And they begin with Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics 2:1, I believe it is, where he talks about das Nichte, or about nothingness and evil. And so they start reading this really high-level, abstract theological discussion, and they get lost, and they don't know where to go from there. That's a mistake. You're going to find, if you try to do something like that, that you are going to get probably discouraged fairly quickly. You want to ease your way into the topic. It's like if you want to train for a marathon, you don't initially go out and try to run 26 miles. You begin with a 3 miles or 4 miles, and you work your way up to the full marathon. And that's the same thing with research. You work your way up to the high-level material. A place to begin, a very practical place, is with a dictionary. And by this, I don't simply mean a Merriam-Webster dictionary or an Oxford English dictionary. I'm meaning like a theological dictionary, a dictionary of theological terms, Bible handbooks, things like that. Those can be very useful places to begin. They may give you a 1 or 2 page summary of something. For example, I wrote a dictionary of Christian philosophy a few years ago with a friend of mine. If you turn into it and you look up evil, problem of, because let's say you're doing the problem of evil, you will find 2 pages, around 400 words, discussing the problem of evil. Very quick overview. Takes about a minute, 2 minutes to read. But right there, you've got an initial orientation to the field. And that's a good foundation now on which to build a little bit more. So I always recommend students find some good theological dictionaries, handbooks, introductions, and begin to work their way into the topic. Same thing with encyclopedias. Typically, a theological encyclopedia, you may find various, and so again, I don't mean simply an Encyclopedia Britannica, but encyclopedias are just compendia with longer essay introductions. So instead of 300-400 words or 200 words or 100 words in a dictionary discussing a topic, you may find a 1,000 word or 2,000 word introduction to the topic. So a little bit more comprehensive. Elwell's Evangelical Dictionary of Theology really is a little bit more like an encyclopedia in this sense. It's a little bit longer in its treatment of the topics. From then on, you could go on to full book-length treatments of the topic. But again, I would recommend going to books that identify themselves as introductions, as primers, as handbooks, as surveys of the topic. And so once again, you'll find yourself getting a better understanding of this topic. Let's say again, it's the problem of evil. Well, I'll begin with a book that's just generally discussing the problem of evil so that you're getting a better handle on the issue. From then on, you can go on to more academic books, academic essays, and journal articles that are published in peer-reviewed journals. And those are really giving you the cutting-edge research on the topic. But you will note that if you follow this procedure, if you begin with the dictionaries, encyclopedias, the full-length book, handbooks, surveys, primers, then once you get to the academic books, essays, and journal articles, you will have some familiarity with the field, and you will find that you're not immediately getting overwhelmed with it. Now, one important topic to address is the distinction between primary sources and secondary sources. What is the difference? Well, that really depends on what your topic is. If your topic is the Bible, then the primary source material is the Bible. The secondary source material is commentary on the Bible, and you can engage in both. If you're writing an English paper on Ernest Hemingway, your primary source material is anything written by Hemingway. Your secondary source material is commentary on Hemingway. If you're writing a history paper on Martin Luther, your primary source material is what Luther wrote. Your secondary source material is what others wrote about Luther. Now, it's important to keep this in mind because sometimes people will write on a topic and they will only engage in the secondary source material. They never engage in the Bible itself. They're only engaging in commentaries. They cite sources talking about Luther's life, but they show no evidence that they've actually read anything that Luther wrote. Well, that's going to be a problem, because if you are writing a paper on Martin Luther, it is important to go to the secondary source material. You can't ignore it, but you also have to engage with the primary source material. You have to go back and look at what Luther himself wrote. If you are writing a paper on Scripture, you don't just look at the commentaries, although you should look at them, but you also have to go back to Scripture itself and maybe do some primary exegesis, as that is relevant to the paper. And so it is with any other paper in theology or any other field. You must keep this distinction in mind between primary and secondary sources, and where relevant, engage with both of them. You don't want to fall into the trap of simply relying on what others have said and only engaging in secondary sources. You do have to spend some time engaging in the primary source material. Now, in my last slide with you, I want to spend some time talking in particular about academic journals and academic journal articles. As I call them here, the forgotten resource. Sometimes students, they will have some books, some essays from books, maybe some magazine articles, but they won't engage in academic journal articles. So what I want to say is a little bit about what academic journals are, why they present a challenge to research, why students sometimes don't bother with them, but also why it is important to engage with them. What academic journals are not. Academic journals are not popular magazines. Now, somewhat facetiously, I say one way to tell an academic journal apart from a magazine is it looks more like a book, and it probably doesn't have more than 3 colors on the cover. Whereas a magazine, looks like a magazine. It's thin, it's larger, and has a lot of colors, probably photos and different pictures and things on the cover. So academic journals tend to look like books. They are published 2, 3, 4 times a year. The key, however, is that they are peer-reviewed. And that means that when people submit an article for publication in an academic journal, before the journal article is published, it is not simply edited for style, as a magazine's article would be. It is also reviewed by other peers, blind reviewed by other peers in the field, blind meaning that they don't know who wrote it, but they will read it and say whether this meets the academic standards of the journal. And a journal article must pass peer review in order to be published in the journal. The idea behind an academic journal is it's meant to provide a forum for the ongoing publication of peer-reviewed research. So it's meant to be cutting edge in the field, whether that field is history, theology, philosophy, the sciences, or any other field. So academic journals are not magazines. They're not popular distillations of material for the general audience. They are academic in nature, and they're made for a specialized academic audience. So that's what they are. They are meant to present the latest in academic research. This presents a challenge for the layperson and the student, especially the more novice student, because you are often more like a layperson than an academic specialist in the field. So the challenge is that you will often find academic journals especially challenging in trying to understand some of the arguments being presented within them. Sometimes they are too complex. Sometimes the topics are too specific as well. So let's say you are writing a general biography paper on Martin Luther for a history class, and you find that there is a journal article published on simply talking about Luther's exchange at Marburg in 1529 with Ulrich Zwingli. And it may be a great article, but you maybe don't need 25 or 30 pages talking about that one historical event, because you're doing a broad overview of Luther's life. Now that's one of the challenges with academic journals, is they're sometimes too specific in their content for your paper. But they're also very valuable, because if you can find research that is pertaining to your paper topic, you will likely get very relevant research, because it is precisely finely tuned to the topic you are addressing, and it is current. It is up to date. This is the latest academic research ongoing in the field. Now, one more footnote I'm just going to add here is academic journals in the humanities are different than the sciences. In the sciences, it is quite typical that you will not be engaging in your research in any articles that are perhaps older than 5, certainly older than 10 years, because the material dates so quickly. It is different in the humanities. In the humanities, you can look up academic journal articles and find valuable research that was written 2, 3, 4 years ago, but also 30 or 40 years ago, because many of the issues are perennial issues that we come back to time and again. So don't discriminate against older academic peer-reviewed journal articles. You can get all sorts of good material. And one more thing to keep in mind, most of the academic journals are still available only through the libraries, either hard copies in the libraries or through your library web server in digital format. But there are a handful of journals that are public domain on the internet, and there is a growing trend to have more that are available in that way. If you have any questions for a professor about whether a particular website you found is in fact a quality, credible academic peer-reviewed journal, simply ask your professor about it, and he or she can inform you as to whether it meets the requirements for research in your course.
Hi, Jerry Shepard here. I'm covering a section in this presentation originally put together by Dr. Syd Page, Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Taylor Seminary. And he dubbed this Syd's Top 10 Writing Errors to Avoid. The first error that Syd calls attention to is the sentence fragment. On the left-hand side, you have a wrong example, and on the right-hand side, you have that same example corrected. A wrong example of the sentence would be the sentence fragment. Quite an area of debate in New Testament study, with scholars taking all sorts of positions. There's no subject, there's no verb, and so on the right-hand side, we have this put into sentence form. This is quite an area of debate in New Testament study, with scholars taking all sorts of positions. You are writing scholarly papers, which goes beyond casual conversation. So everything you have in your papers should be framed in complete sentences. The second error is the comma splice or fused sentence. Wrong. Final eschatology is stronger in 1 John than in the Gospel of John. There is more emphasis on the parousia as the moment of accountability for Christian life in the epistle. Now here you've got, in essence, two independent sentences joined together by a comma. Sometimes in very short sentences you can do this, but in longer sentences like this, it's much better to do something else. One way you could do it, and the one that Syd characterizes as right, is to turn it into two sentences with a period between them. Final eschatology is stronger in 1 John than in the Gospel of John. There is more emphasis on the parousia as the moment of accountability for Christian life in the epistle. Another way you could do this would be, instead of using a period after the word John, you could put a semicolon, and then you'd have a lowercase t. So you'd have a compound sentence with the, a compound sentence with the clauses separated by a semicolon. But the longer your sentences are, the better it would be to actually use the periods. The third of Syd's top 10 also has to do with punctuation and the missing comma. On the left-hand side, wrong. In Brown's view, we may distinguish at least 4 figures in the Johannine school responsible for the Gospel and epistles. Syd corrects that on the right side by putting a comma after the word view. In Brown's view, we may distinguish at least 4 figures in the Johannine school responsible for the Gospel and epistles. So this is not absolutely necessary, but I think it's quite helpful in longer sentences to indeed insert the comma just to make sure that you break things up properly, and it sort of reflects the way we speak as well. One other thing I would mention here that Syd does not call attention to, but notice at the end of the sentence we have 4 elements there separated by commas: the beloved disciple, the evangelist, the presbyter of the epistles, and the redactor of the gospel. Sometimes you'll find in some style guides the suggestion that before the word and, you don't need the comma. However, the Chicago Manual of Style, upon which the SBL handbook is based, prefers this Oxford comma, it's called. So even if you have just a list of 3 or 4 things, and of course the last item begins with the word and, still have that comma in there just before the word and. Number 4 is lack of subject-verb agreement. A wrong example: the community of believers in Rome include Priscilla and Aquila. The right example, or the corrected example, would be the community of believers in Rome includes Priscilla and Aquila. On the left-hand side, the mistake has happened because the writer has let that phrase of believers help determine which verb to pick. But of believers is not the subject. The subject is the word community, and of believers is a prepositional phrase modifying the word community. You can tell that you've got the wrong verb if you simply leave that phrase out. The community in Rome include Priscilla and Aquila. That doesn't even sound right. So you have to make sure that when you have a singular noun and then you modify it with a plural adjective or prepositional phrase, that you don't let that override the fact that you do have the singular noun, and it should take the verb that goes with singular nouns. Number 5 is the ambiguous antecedent. On the left-hand side, the community John addressed included both those who shared his views and those who opposed them. Now, the problem in the sentence is that last pronoun, them. It's hard to tell from the sentence whether it's referring to those who shared his views or whether it's referring to his views. And so sometimes you may need to get a bit more cumbersome or add additional words, but that's okay if it preserves the clarity. So on the right-hand side, we have a corrected example. The community John addressed included both those who shared his views and those who opposed his teaching. And now in this example, it's very clear that the opposition is not to those who shared his views, but to the views, to the teaching. Number 6, wrong word. Here, Dr. Page gives 3 very interesting examples of pairs of words that can be confused with each other. For the first one, we have infer versus imply. The problem here is that the word infer sometimes gets used incorrectly in both popular writing and casual conversation as if it had the same meaning as the word imply, but the two words have very different meanings. Implying is what a speaker or writer does, and usually they do this indirectly. Inferring is what a listener or reader does. For example, by something I say, I might indirectly be implying that you're out to lunch. You, on the other hand, might infer from what I say that I am implying that you're out to lunch. So a speaker or writer makes an implication, a listener or reader draws an inference. A speaker or writer implies, a listener or reader infers or draws a conclusion based on what they have heard or read. Then we come to the words that and which. The difference between these words is a bit trickier and the rules less hard and fast on account of dialectal and regional differences, but I'll note 2 things here. First, the word that can be either a relative pronoun or a conjunction, but the word which is only a relative pronoun. So it would be wrong to use the word which when the sentence calls for a conjunction. For example, in the sentence, I told him that he should go to the store, the word that is a conjunction, and the word which should never be used in its place. It would be incorrect to say, I told him which he should go to the store. The real problem from these 2 words comes with their usages as relative pronouns. The rule of thumb here is that the pronoun that should be used in restrictive clauses and the pronoun which in non-restrictive clauses. Restrictive means that the information in the relative clause is essential information. Non-restrictive means that the relative clause contains non-essential information. Here are examples of each. The race cars that have numbers on them are for sale. The race cars, which have numbers on them, are for sale. In the first sentence, the meaning is that only the race cars that have numbers on them are for sale. The restrictive pronoun that helps identify the race cars that are for sale. It is essential information. But in the second sentence, the meaning is that the race cars are for sale and, oh, by the way, they have numbers on them. The information really is not essential for identifying which cars are for sale. But again, I must add that sometimes, due to dialectal and regional differences, these distinctions can be blurred. Finally, for the last example, who or whom, the difference is that who is a subject pronoun and whom is an object pronoun. Who is always the subject of a clause, and whom is always an object of a verb or preposition. So, correct usages of who would be the following: the person who came to the store, the man who hit the ball, the lady who bought the car, who is coming to dinner. Correct usages of whom would be: to whom did you give the ticket? Whom are you going to call? Whom did you invite to dinner? Whom did you hit the ball to? Though it is important to point out that for this last one, that's a bit of a colloquialism and shouldn't be used in scholarly writing. So more correctly, it would be, to whom did you hit the ball? Number 7 has to do with apostrophe errors. And here there are 3 popular confusions that Dr. Page points out. The first one is the confusion between the second person possessive pronoun, y-o-u-r, versus the contraction of the subject and verb clause, you-are. So you would use the first one, y-o-u-r, to refer to possession, your house, your cat, your dog, your parents. The second one would be used when you mean you are. And so these should not be confused. And I might just note here that apart from our concern here about scholarly writing, this is a concern also for PowerPoint slides in churches on Sunday mornings as well. The second one has to do with its, either its or it apostrophe s. The first one is the possessive, and so if you want to refer to its place or its sentence or its something, it will be its. But if you want to say it is and contract that, it would be it apostrophe s. And then finally, a mistake that is commonly made both in writing and in speaking is what you do when you want to turn the name Jesus into a possessive word. And so you do this not by adding apostrophe s, but by simply adding the apostrophe. And so if you want to refer to Jesus' disciples, you would write that as Jesus with an apostrophe and not apostrophe s. Furthermore, you would not pronounce the extra s either. So it's Jesus' apostles, Jesus' disciples, Jesus' teaching. Number 8 has to do with common misspellings, and this comes in conjunction with words that are very similar either in writing or in pronunciation. The first one has to do with the difference between prophesy and prophecy. Prophesy is the verb. It's what a prophet does. He prophesies. The second one is the noun. The result of his prophesying is a prophecy. So the first one ends in sy, the second one ends in cy. The second example, 2 words that don't have anything to do with each other as far as meaning. The first one is a noun. It refers to the place where you put your sacrifice. It's the altar, or the place that you march toward when you go down the aisle in a church. The second one, alter, A-L-T-E-R, is the verb. You alter a hymn, etc. The third one, again, very different words. S-I-T-E, site, refers to a place. The place that you put something, a web site. But C-I-T-E is the verb where you cite someone or cite something. You make a quotation. And finally, in this list of misspellings, there versus there. T-H-E-I-R is the possessive pronoun. Their dog, their cat, their house, their car. T-H-E-R-E instead refers to a location. I put it over there. So that's the difference here, and these are pretty common as they show up in papers that are turned in to us. Number 9 deals with the difference between adjectives and adverbs, or adjectives being incorrectly used as adverbs. Adjectives are words that are used to modify or describe nouns. Adverbs are words that are used to modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. In the example that Dr. Page uses here, we have good versus well. In the wrong example, you did good on your examination. Now, good is an adjective, but it's modifying the word did in this sentence, which is a verb. Therefore, it's being used incorrectly. What needs to be used here is an adverb, and therefore on the right side, we have the corrected sentence, you did well on your examination. Finally, for number 10, we have article errors. And all Dr. Page notes here is that those whose first language is not English often have difficulty knowing when to use the definite article the in their sentence constructions. And this is because there never is a one-to-one correspondence between different languages as to how they use or don't use definite articles, indefinite articles, etc. And so Dr. Page simply refers you here to a very useful little book by William Strunk and E.B. White entitled The Elements of Style. And then we can also mention that there are a number of websites that you can access which talk about some of the things we've mentioned in these Syd's top 10 list, as well as knowing how to use the definite article the.
In this section of the seminar, we want to deal with some stylistic matters of your paper. This is, after all, a research paper, which is quite different from an assignment like a sermon that you might hand in, or a Bible study that you might prepare for a youth group or a seniors group. It is something that would be actually suitable for publication. So there's a certain formality to the use of language in a research paper. At the same time, don't overdo the formality with undue flowery language to try to impress your professor. But it certainly should not be a casual sounding paper. A common issue that students come and ask us about is how to refer to yourself in the paper. In times past, people would use the first person plural, we, or this author says this, or this author is of the opinion of. But today we find it much more acceptable to just use I, as you normally would in conversation or in writing. Even in some scholarly writing, the word I appears quite a bit, but don't overdo it. But you don't need to use these other fancy ways of expressing who you are. Just be natural about it. One thing we are all very particular about here at Taylor is the use of gender-neutral language. You will lose points on your paper if you do not abide by this particular rule. And you need to train yourself already as a communicator in your preaching, your speaking, and in your writing to be sure to use inclusive language. Now, sometimes that's a bit awkward and you find yourself writing his/her, himself/herself. And so our writing guide on pages 13 and 14 offers a number of good tips on how to avoid unnecessary gender-specific language or pronouns. When referring to God in your papers, you may refer to God with masculine pronouns, but make sure you don't capitalize them. They're not capitalized in the Bible, and it's not necessary for you to capitalize pronouns referring to God in your paper. This slide is fairly self-explanatory. One tip I offer to you is that you can add the insert footnote icon to your top left-hand menu and just access it immediately up there instead of having to always go and move to insert and find footnote, and it might save you a couple of steps that way. Also, Appendix 3 in your Research and Writing Guide has all the correct abbreviations, including those of Bible translations, so become familiar with that. Again, this slide is fairly self-explanatory as well. What is usually practiced is that on the very first quotation of a scripture, you may make a footnote and say that this reference and all subsequent references are from the NRSV or the NIV, unless otherwise noted, and then all subsequent quotations from Scripture are understood to be from that translation. One item that does not appear in your editorial style in your guide is the matter of the placement of headers at the bottom of pages. It's one of my pet peeves. Never should you have the header beginning a new section of your paper at the bottom of a page with no text attached to it but the text on the following page. So make sure if you're coming to an end of a page and you're starting a new section to advance that header with a hard control to the next page so that the header is at the very top and not at the very bottom without text attached to it. If you are writing a paper that contains graphs or tables, charts, figures, make sure you include a list of those at the table of contents. If there are a significant number of them, they should be properly footnoted, acknowledge their source. So let's say if you have a table of religious affiliation in Manitoba, then you would put a footnote at the end of that title and then put down in the footnote statistic or statcan.ca or the place that you found that statistic. Also, any tools that you have developed for the collection of data for your research paper should be found in the appendices of your paper. For instance, if you used a map of a neighborhood that was surveyed, you may want to include that map, the questionnaire that you used when interviewing elders in the congregation about their perception of missional effectiveness, a brochure advertising a workshop that you may have done as part of your assignment for that paper, or an evaluation form that may have been used for people to give feedback on your particular workshop or lesson that you taught. Those kinds of tools should be included in the appendices.
Hello again, Jerry Shepard back here. Now for this and the next few slides, we'll be talking about proper formatting for your papers with regards to documentation, footnotes and bibliography. Footnotes and bibliographies serve two different purposes. Footnotes provide information at the bottom of each page as to the source of information that has been provided on that page. A bibliography at the end of the paper provides an alphabetical listing of all sources used in the paper. On this slide, I call attention to some differences between footnotes and bibliographical entries. In footnotes, there is no reason to give the author's last name first. You just give the regular order. In the bibliography, however, the last name should come first, since the bibliography is organized alphabetically. In footnotes, the most used marks of punctuation are the comma and the semicolon. In the bibliography, the period is the major punctuation mark. Now, you may still use periods in footnotes, and you may still use commas and semicolons in bibliographical entries, but I'm just calling attention to the fact here that for the most part in footnotes, it'll be comma and semicolon, and for the most part in bibliographies, it'll be the period. Some further differences are that in footnotes, all information other than author, title, and page number is put in a parenthesis. In the bibliography, a parenthesis is used only for a journal's year of publication. So in footnotes, use parentheses for a number of items, but in bibliographical entries, you only use a parenthesis with regards to a journal's year of publication. In footnotes, abbreviations should be used for journal titles and names of series, but in the bibliography, you will write those journal titles and names of series, you'll write those out completely. A couple of other differences here. In a footnote, the first line is indented and the rest of the footnote is flush to the left margin. In the bibliography, the first line of each entry is flush to the left margin, and the rest of the entry is given a hanging indentation. In footnotes, only the actual pages containing the material you are citing should be indicated. In the bibliography, all page numbers for articles should be given, but of course you would not do this for entire books. On this and the next two slides, we'll have some important footnoting tips, which both give some new information as well as repeats some of the information on the previous slides. First of all, don't put the author's last name first. Just give it in the regular order. The author's name is separated from the title of the article or book by a comma. After the book title, all other information other than the page number is put in a parenthesis. Do not use any punctuation immediately before a parenthesis. Commas should come after the parenthesis. Continuing with footnoting tips, only book titles or journal names should be italicized. You do not italicize the title of an article or a series in which a book appears. Subsequent references to an already cited source should be given a shortened title, but do not refer to a source by only the author's name. Continuing on, some more footnoting tips. No abbreviation is necessary to indicate page numbers, so you don't have to use P period or two P's a period. Page numbers for a journal should be prefaced by a colon. If a footnote refers to the same source and the same page number as cited in the immediately preceding footnote, all you have to do is write the word IBID, I-B-I-D, with a period. If it is the same source but a different page number, then you can still use IBID, and then you would simply, after the period, put a comma and the page number. This slide has to do with giving inclusive page numbers. That is, when you're giving a range of page numbers. And there are various rules which can also be referenced in literature, but you can always use this slide here to give you the same information. If you're talking about 2 digits in your page numbers, then give all the numbers. So pages, let's say 81 through 89, you write all the numbers, 81-89. If your numbers have 3 digits and the first number ends in 2 zeros, again, give all the pages. So pages 100 through 104, your first number ends in 2 zeros, so you give all the numbers. The third rule here is, again, 3 digits, and the first number ends in either 01 or through 09. If that's the case, you give only what changes. So 104-5, 109-37. And then finally, if it's 3 digits or more and the first number ends in either the numbers 10 or through the number 99, you give 2 digits or more as needed. So 134-39, 131-47, 1031-89. So 4 fairly simple rules there to help you to know how you can do your inclusive numbers. Okay, that was a lot of information. Now on this slide and the next few slides, we'll give some examples that apply the rules that I've given you on the previous slides. So here is a book example. Here we first of all give a footnote. The author is James D.G. Dunn. So we don't put his last name first. We put a comma after his last name. Then the title of the book is put in italics. The title of the book is Romans 1-8. Now everything else after that is going to come in parentheses except for the page number. In parentheses, we put the series title in abbreviated letters. And by the way, you can't make up these abbreviations. There are specifications for them, and the style guide that we have on the website, the Guide for Research and Writing, SBL Style, gives you what are the legitimate abbreviations. So in this case, WBC for Word Biblical Commentary, and then you give the volume number, semicolon, Dallas, place of publication, colon, the publishing company, Word, and we generally do not put publishing or publishing company or publishers after the name of the publisher unless it's a university press. After Word, comma, 1998, into parentheses, then you have the comma. You don't have a comma before the parentheses, but afterwards, and 134, and we don't have to put any abbreviation, P or P before the number. If the very next footnote was going to come from the same source, all we would have to do is put the word ibid there, as I mentioned on a previous slide, and then if the page number changes, indicate that. What I've given you here is a subsequent footnote, but not immediately subsequent. So in that case, you put the author's last name, Dunn, a title. In this case, Romans 1-8 is a pretty short title. If it was a much longer title than that, you could still give a shorter version of it, and then, of course, the page number. Now, notice in the last entry here, notice how the bibliographical information and formatting is different from the footnote. For the bibliography, the first line is flush to the left margin. Everything else, all the subsequent lines occur in a hanging indentation. So we have his last name first for bibliography because this is ordered alphabetically, then his first name and middle name or initials, James, DG. Title, and that ends with a period. So as opposed to the footnote where you separate the name from the title with a comma, we use a period here. Then the title, Romans 1-8, period. The series, Word, Biblical Commentary 38A, period. And then place of publication, name of the publisher, and the publication date. Dallas, Word, 1998. So you see some of the differences that take place here. Now we move to a journal article example, and the example that I have here is an article by Syd Page. So we have the name of the author, Sidney H.T. Page, comma, then the title of the article, and notice the title is not italicized. Whose ministry? A reappraisal of Ephesians 4-12, comma, and now we italicize the name of the journal in which the article appears. And because it's a journal, and there is a fairly recognized abbreviations for most of these journals, we have the abbreviation. So this particular journal is abbreviated NOVT. Then it's issue 47, or journal volume 47, year 2005, :34. Again, if we were going to give in a subsequent footnote a reference to the same source, we can abbreviate that by giving just the author's last name, Page. We can give a shortened title, whose ministry, and then page 41 if it's a different page. Then notice in the last item here is our bibliographical information. So again, because it's a bibliography, we give the last name first, and it's flush to the left margin, Page, Sidney H.T. And again, periods are our preferred separation punctuation marks in the bibliography. Whose ministry? A reappraisal of Ephesians 4:12, period. And then, because it's the bibliography, we will write out the journal title, Novum Testamentum 47, 2005. And then, because it's the bibliography, we give the entire page range for the article, not just the page cited, but the entire page range, 26 to 46. Finally, for this section, we give an article in book example. This article was written by Thomas Oden, and here's the way it works in the footnote. First of all, the full name, Thomas Oden. Again, we don't put the last name first, comma. Then the title of the article, No Other Gods, comma. And then you give the title of the book, I Am the Lord Your God, Christian Reflections on the Ten Commandments. No punctuation mark, parentheses, ED for edited or identifying the editors, Carl E. Bratton and Christopher R. Seitz, semicolon, Grand Rapids, Erdmans, 2005, comma, page 48. Now, when you give the same information in a bibliographical reference, a bibliography citation, it works out this way. Again, it's flush to the left margin. We put the author's last name first, Oden, comma, Thomas, period. Then the name of the article, No Other Gods, period. Again, the article is not italicized. Pages 41 to 54, the entire range, and now we give the title of the book, and it's italicized, I Am the Lord Your God, Christian Reflections on the Ten Commandments, period. We write out the word edited this time, edited by Carl E. Bratton and Christopher R. Seitz, Grand Rapids, Erdmans, 2005. And that's the way that particular kind of entry works.